Richard Johnson is the CEO and founder of Texture Capital. He's a finance and fintech professional with significant experience in markets, innovation, and disruptive technologies. He began his career in quantitative finance, then moved into electronic trading. In 2014, he shifted focus to emerging technologies, particularly crypto and blockchain, as a consultant, advisor, trader, and founder. And he's a treasured partner of Vertalo, and great to have you on stage with Gautam Gujral. So
thanks so much,
Dave.
Take
it away.
So thanks everybody for being here. You know, it was funny when I first met Richard. It was through an introduction of a mutual friend. And he said, yeah, he's doing something like blockchain, whatever. Man, you seem to be doing the same thing. You guys should connect. And 3 years later, here we are working together all the time. So, but we wanted to talk about ATSs and how ATSs came about, what they do, and the different types of ATSs there are, and what the future might look like.
Yeah, so I was actually talking to Dave a couple of weeks ago about some ideas for content. I'm thinking, I thought it'd be really good to talk about, how ATSs have evolved over the years and all the innovation they've brought to markets, public markets so far, but now in private markets, and specifically digital assets. And he said, oh, I know, then you should talk to Gautam. Gautam should do a fireside with you, because he was at the SEC when Reg ATS came into effect. So I'm going to actually turn this over to you, Gautam. Tell us about how Reg ATS came into effect. And was it 96?
Yes. So what happened was, our son had just been born, and we'd gone to India on vacation and for a wedding. And I come back to the office in Washington, and I go into my office. This lady walks in, right, she's a senior person. She says, okay, listen, just keep your door closed. Don't take any assignments from anybody until I come back, and we're going to have a chat. I'm like, wow, okay, that's not the way the SEC usually works. And so pulled me into a room and 3 other people and said, basically, look, we're tired of all of these alternative trading systems or communications networks coming to us asking for no action relief because they're worried that we might deem them to be a unregistered exchange. And we need to figure out a way that these alternative trading systems can continue to be broker-dealers only operated alternative trading systems, and that the exchanges can continue to be exchanges but become more nimble and more profitable, because that's what they've been complaining about, is that all our rules basically make them very difficult to operate. So, and the last marching orders was, don't come back in a few months and tell us that we have to go to the Hill to get legislation done. Okay, that's just not in the cards. So you guys figure out, but just based upon the regulations that we have on our books and the history of those, figure out a way that we can propose to the world how this is going to look in the future. So that took a long, long time to do. Okay, so there was, it was involved like going into the basement of the SEC and getting these old files from long gone people and figuring out what their thought processes were and particular rules and this and that. And the end result was, we wrote a concept release on the future of alternative trading systems and the New York Stock, not New York Stock, and exchanges in general. And so it's not that thick, and it was very well received. And at that point in 1997, I said, look, I'm going to leave now because I know what my next year is going to look like. It's going to be more of the same, and I've just been working 60-hour weeks, 70-hour weeks. I think I'm going to take it easy and go work for an investment bank. But by and large, what was laid out in that paper was accepted and got incorporated into regs that were, that got adopted. I think it was a straight yes vote by the entire commission, and that's really what's led to a huge growth in the ATS market. But also, if you think about it, has made the exchanges, the national securities exchanges, much more profitable, partly because they were able to spin off on a lot of their self-regulatory organizations, their regulatory arms, into one larger group called FINRA now, right? So it seems to have worked really well in the public markets.
Well, you brought up a good point there, is that, so Reg ATS is part of the Exchange Act. It was added in 97. And you have to be a broker-dealer to operate an ATS. And there's different rules for ATSs versus exchanges, which are much more structured, how they must interact. There's things like Reg NMS now. But the ATSs were kind of free to come up with new ideas, new ways of doing things, serving just specific customer types and so forth. So they've been a real hotbed of innovation. Some of the first ones, I think, at the beginning there that you probably had no action letters for were, Instnet's probably the oldest one.
POSIT.
And then POSIT. So POSIT was run by a company called ITG, where I actually worked. And this is a very interesting product. It actually stands for Portfolio System for Institutional Trading. And what they did, they built a crossing network, essentially, to serve very large index managers. That's how it started out, at least. And an index manager, when they're trading in a dark pool and they put their orders in, the last thing they want to happen is to have all their buys get executed and get stuck with the sells, because then they've got market exposure that they don't want. So that ATS actually had a quadratic optimization function in it, so that it could optimize the output as part of the auction to make sure that both sides came out balanced. That's very, very useful for these large index managers. And then I think that we talked about another thing on the call, that there's a bit of a tailwind for the ATSs back then, because right before Reg ATS, there'd been a NASDAQ collusion scandal, basically. And the very interesting, I think it's fascinating the way this was discovered, is actually two academics wrote a paper saying, why don't NASDAQ market makers quote in odd eighths? And basically, they figured out that there was collusion by looking at the data. And they saw that, well, they're always quoting a quarter to a half, or a half to three quarters, never a half to 5/8, because of course, with a larger spread, with a spread of a quarter, you get 25 cents a spread to make money on versus 12.5. So that came out. That was a big scandal. There's a preceding rule change which increased competition there. But I think there's a big tailwind for the ATSs. And what also came along were things called ECNs. They've kind of gone away now. But that was a kind of an ATS, an electronic communications network. And they were basically order books, and they were competing with the established exchanges, as NASDAQ and NYSE, who at that point traded something like 90% of all equity trades. Now, by the way, in talking about public markets, about 45% of public equity trading is done in an ATS or done off exchange. So that's how important they are to market structure now. But anyway, these ECNs came out, and they saying, well, NYSE and NASDAQ are the dominant players here, and we need to compete. We need to get the liquidity. How do we get the liquidity? So they came out with an ingenious idea at the time of saying, well, how about we have bifurcated pricing? So they changed their pricing model, and they said, we'll pay you to post liquidity on the exchange, and someone who takes the liquidity off will pay a fee to us. So you get essentially a rebate for adding liquidity, and if you took liquidity off, you would pay a fee. And the difference between the rebate and the fee was the ECN's profit. That had never been done before, and of course that's a great way to attract liquidity. If you had a passive limit order, you would go to one of these ECNs and put it on there because you get paid for posting it, as opposed to sending it to the NYSE. Well, New York Stock Exchange didn't like that, because they were coming in on their turf. And there was a kind of a loose rule at the time called, through this thing called the intermarket trading system, where NYSE was a self-regulatory organization at the time, and they're supposed to abide by the NBBO, the National Best Bid and Offer, but they never did, and it was never enforced. And Archipelago, which is one of the main ECNs at the time, created this computer program that would file a complaint automatically every time the New York Stock Exchange traded through one of their quotes, meaning if they had a higher priced bid or a lower priced offer on their platform, and the NYSE traded outside of that, they would send an automated complaint. They were doing something like 70, and they called it the whiner, because they were just complaining all the time. And they did about 7,500 complaints a week based on trade-throughs on NYSE. Do you know how they, you know how NYSE actually eventually shut down the Winer?
No.
They bought Archipelago.
Okay, well, that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
But that also became like a mini fine industry for FINRA or NSDR back then, right? Since all the trade-through violations for every firm got slapped with a fine every single day, and that kind of came to an end.
Yeah. And of course, after NYSE bought this ATS, this little startup ATS, they then integrated all that technology, and it eventually became a core part of NASDAQ's NYSE's matching technology, and I think NYSE eventually changed their pricing model as well at the same time around then. So I think that's another example of how these ATSs were able to innovate and eventually transform all of market structure, not just their little corner.
And so, you know, in thinking about how creative ATSs have been and how they've been incorporated into the equity markets as a whole, you know, we're actually quite excited about what the future holds for ATSs in the private markets. Now, this is a new thing. Okay, it didn't really exist. There was like one internal matching engine that I recall at Credit Suisse, one internal matching engine for private securities, for 144A securities at Goldman Sachs. But those systems like really did not take off or garner much liquidity. So now that there are ATSs that are like yours and T0 that we heard from earlier, coming to market with North Capital and a whole bunch of others, like, I'm looking forward to the day when they compete with their own algorithms, their trading mechanisms. What else do you see happening there?
Yeah, I think so. You know, we're rebuilding new ATSs for this market structure. And in fact, I often say we're building a new market structure using blockchain and digital assets here. So I think, you know, the one thing we have in common is that we're focusing on digital assets and leveraging blockchain technology here. But we all have slightly different nuances to how we are operating our ATS. The texture ATS is a call auction model, and in fact, John's going to be demoing that later. My co-founder sitting over there, and yeah, so I think there's somebody talking about interoperability on another panel, and at some point, I think we're not quite there yet. Everyone's got to kind of get a bit of a liquidity pool going themselves, but when that time comes, you know, texture's going to be connecting with, you know, let's say Oasis or Templum or T0, and we're going to be able to look to some of the tools and some of the techniques that have been done before in public markets. One example I'm thinking of is something called a conditional order. So what that is basically if, you know, one of the problems you have is, let's say you got a buyer on one ATS and a seller on the other ATS. So a trade wants to happen, but they're not matching up. So the concept of a conditional order is where either the investor or a routing engine could essentially put orders on multiple exchanges at the same time, or multiple ATSs at the same time, but it's conditional order, so it won't automatically execute. What will happen is, you know, when there's a signal that there's a counterparty and a trade can happen, it'll remove all the orders from the other platforms to ensure there's no over-execution, and then it'll execute the trade. So I think that's an innovation I think we're going to see in this space, you know, fairly soon, maybe this time next year.
Well, that would be an extremely fast timeline, but yeah.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, okay. And any particular like regulatory matters that do not really, well, how should I put this? That are applicable to ATSs as a whole, but you feel that are not necessarily applicable to ATSs in private markets?
No, I think that's the beauty of ATSs is that they aren't as prescribed in how you have to operate them. So, for example, you know, if you're an exchange, you know, you have to accept orders from everyone. You can't, you know, whereas if you're a broker-dealer running an ATS, we can decide to turn down a customer if we want to. What I've also seen in public markets is you can have ATSs that discriminate flow. So if an investor says, well, I only want to participate with retail flow, I don't want to trade against high-frequency market makers, that was a business model that a lot of ATSs used. So I think it's one of the key advantages of what we're doing here is that we have so much flexibility and we can all experiment until we figure out what's working, and then I think specifically around digital assets, we could well see this being adopted by the public markets as well.
That's great. That was just a short overview of the history and the future of ATSs. We think that it's ideally suited for bringing liquidity to those private assets that we've been discussing during this conference. And if you have any questions, please approach us, and we'll be happy to answer them.